The champagne glass slipped from my trembling fingers as my daughter's words echoed across the elegant reception hall. "You're embarrassing me, Mom." "Just leave." The crystal shattered against the marble floor, much like my heart in that moment. What she didn't know was that in my purse sat the keys to her future. A trust fund worth $12 million that I'd spent 25 years building. What happened next changed everything between us forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Catherine Wells, and at 58, I thought I'd seen every possible way a person could be humiliated. I was wrong. Standing in the opulent ballroom of the Riverside Country Club, watching my only daughter Emma dismiss me like I was some unwanted stranger, I realized that the deepest cuts always come from the people we love most. The morning had started with such promise. I'd driven 3 hours from my modest apartment in Millbrook to attend Emma's wedding in the prestigious town of Westbridge. The invitation had arrived 6 weeks earlier, written in elegant script on cream-colored paper that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. Emma Catherine Hartwell and Jonathan Michael Sterling cordially invite you to witness their union. The formal tone should have been my first warning that this wasn't going to be the intimate family celebration I'd imagined. I'd spent weeks preparing for this day. The navy blue dress hanging in my closet had been purchased specifically for the occasion, along with matching shoes that pinched my feet but looked appropriately elegant. I'd even splurged on having my graying hair professionally styled at a salon downtown, something I hadn't done in years. Most importantly, I'd finalized the paperwork for Emma's trust fund, a surprise I'd been planning to reveal after the ceremony. The trust fund represented everything I'd sacrificed over the past 2 decades. After my husband David died when Emma was 7, I'd thrown myself into building my small accounting firm into something substantial. Night after night, I'd worked while Emma slept, taking on clients others wouldn't touch, learning investment strategies, making calculated risks that slowly but steadily grew our modest savings into something significant. Every dollar had been earned with Emma's future in mind. When I arrived at the country club that morning, the parking lot was already half full, with luxury vehicles that made my 10-year-old Honda look like it belonged in a different zip code. The building itself was stunning, all white columns and manicured gardens that spoke of old money and established traditions. I felt distinctly out of place, but I was here for Emma, and that was all that mattered. The ceremony itself had been beautiful, though I barely recognized my daughter in her elaborate designer gown that must have cost more than I made in 3 months. She looked radiant walking down the aisle toward Jonathan, a handsome young man whose family owned half the commercial real estate in the county. I'd only met him twice before. Brief encounters where he'd been polite but distant, clearly assessing whether I met his family's standards. From my seat in the 3rd row, not the front where the mother of the bride traditionally sits, I watched Emma exchange vows with a man whose family had made it clear that my presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. The Sterlings occupied the first 2 rows entirely, a sea of perfectly coiffed heads and designer outfits that screamed wealth and privilege. I recognized Jonathan's mother, Margaret Sterling, from the society pages of the local newspaper. She'd given me one cutting look when I'd introduced myself at the rehearsal dinner, and had managed to avoid speaking to me since. The reception began immediately after the ceremony, and that's when the real divide became apparent. The seating chart positioned me at table 9, far from the head table where Emma and Jonathan sat with their wedding party. My table mates were distant relatives and family friends who seemed more interested in gossiping about the other guests than including me in conversation. I watched from afar as Emma laughed and danced, surrounded by people who clearly belonged in her new world in ways I never would. I'd been nursing the same glass of champagne for over an hour, waiting for an appropriate moment to approach Emma with my surprise. The trust fund documents were safely tucked in my purse, along with a heartfelt letter explaining everything I'd done to secure her future. I'd imagined her face lighting up when she realized that her mother, the woman she'd always seen as struggling to make ends meet, had actually managed to build something substantial for her. That's when I noticed Emma's college friend Sarah approaching my table. Sarah had always been kind to me during Emma's university years, often staying for dinner when she visited our small apartment. She looked uncomfortable as she sat down beside me, fidgeting with her pearl necklace. Mrs. Wells, she said quietly, I think you should know that some people are saying things about you being here, about whether you really belong at a wedding like this. My stomach clenched. What kind of things? Sarah glanced around nervously. Margaret Sterling has been telling people that Emma is embarrassed by her background, that she wishes her mother understood her place in this new world Emma's entering. The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd always known that Emma had grown distant since starting her job at the prestigious marketing firm where she'd met Jonathan. Our weekly phone calls had become monthly, then sporadic. Her visits home had stopped altogether after she moved in with Jonathan's family while their new house was being built. I'd told myself it was natural, that young women needed space to build their own lives. I'd never imagined she was actually ashamed of me. I'm sure that's not true, I managed to say, though my voice sounded uncertain even to my own ears. Sarah's expression was sympathetic but grave. I hope not, Mrs. Wells. I really do. But maybe you should talk to Emma directly. Clear the air. After Sarah walked away, I sat at that table for another 20 minutes, watching my daughter from across the room. She was radiant, laughing at something Jonathan's father was saying, completely at ease in this world of wealth and privilege. For the first time, I wondered if my presence here really was making her uncomfortable. If the mother who'd sacrificed everything for her future was now seen as an embarrassment from her past. I finally gathered the courage to approach her during a lull in the dancing. Emma was standing near the head table, adjusting her veil with the help of her maid of honor. When she saw me walking toward her, something shifted in her expression. Not joy or welcome, but something closer to resignation. "Mom," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "How are you enjoying the reception?" "It's lovely, sweetheart. You look absolutely beautiful." I reached out to touch her arm, but she stepped back slightly and I let my hand fall. "I was hoping we could talk for a moment. I have something important to share with you." Emma glanced around the room and I followed her gaze to see Margaret Sterling watching us with obvious disapproval. Jonathan's mother whispered something to the woman beside her, and they both looked in our direction with expressions that made my cheeks burn. "Mom, this really isn't the time or place," Emma said, her voice taking on an edge I'd never heard before. "This is my wedding day. Can't whatever it is wait?" "Of course, but Emma, I just wanted you to know." "Mrs. Wells." Margaret Sterling's voice cut through our conversation like a blade. She'd approached us with the silent efficiency of a predator, her designer dress rustling softly as she positioned herself between Emma and me. "How lovely to see you're enjoying the festivities." The way she said it made it clear that my enjoyment was neither expected nor desired. Emma's face flushed red, and I saw something in her eyes.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
That broke my heart. Shame. She was ashamed of me. "Mrs. Sterling?" I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Thank you for including me in this beautiful celebration." "Of course. Family is so important." Margaret's smile was sharp enough to cut glass, though I do hope you understand that Emma is part of our family now. She'll be moving in entirely different circles, meeting entirely different expectations. The message was clear. I was the past, they were the future, and I needed to know my place. I looked at Emma, waiting for her to say something, to defend me or at least acknowledge that I was still her mother, regardless of social standings. Instead, she looked down at her hands, her silence speaking volumes. "I understand," I said quietly, though I wasn't sure I understood anything anymore. Margaret nodded approvingly. "I'm so glad we're on the same page. Emma's happiness is what matters most, don't you agree?" Before I could respond, she'd glided away, leaving Emma and me standing in awkward silence. My daughter finally looked up at me, and the distance in her eyes was devastating. "Mom, I think maybe you should go," she said softly. "This day is really important to Jonathan's family, and I just need everything to be perfect. Emma, please, just give me 5 minutes. What I have to tell you could change everything." Her expression hardened. "You're embarrassing me, Mom. Just leave." The words hung in the air between us like a death sentence. Around us, the reception continued, laughter and music creating a backdrop that seemed to mock the destruction of our relationship. I felt every eye in the room on us, witnessing my public dismissal by my own daughter. I stood there for a moment longer, hoping she would realize what she'd just said, hoping she would take it back. But Emma had already turned away, moving toward a group of her new in-laws who welcomed her with the warmth she'd just denied me. That's when I dropped the champagne glass. The sound of crystal shattering seemed unnaturally loud in the elegant space, drawing even more attention to my humiliation. A server rushed over with a dustpan and brush, apologizing profusely, as if the broken glass was somehow his fault. I reached into my purse and pulled out the trust fund documents, holding them for a moment as I watched Emma laugh with people who would never love her the way I did. 25 years of sacrifice, of building something substantial for her future, reduced to a stack of papers in my trembling hands. Without a word, I walked toward the exit, passing tables full of people who were probably already discussing what they'd just witnessed. The country club's marble floors echoed with each step of my uncomfortable shoes, a lonely sound that seemed to emphasize how out of place I'd always been in this world. Just before I reached the door, I turned back one last time. Emma was dancing with Jonathan now, her face radiant with joy, completely unbothered by the fact that she'd just banished her mother from the most important day of her life. In that moment, I made a decision that would change everything. I pulled out my phone and called my attorney, Richard Morrison, who'd been handling my estate planning for years. He answered on the second ring, probably wondering why I was calling on a Saturday evening. "Richard, it's Catherine Wells. I need you to make an immediate change to the trust fund we discussed." "Yes, today. I'll be in your office first thing Monday morning with new instructions." As I walked to my car in the darkening parking lot, I could hear the music and laughter continuing inside the country club. Emma's wedding was proceeding perfectly without me, just as she'd wanted. What she didn't know was that her future had just changed dramatically. The trust fund that would have made her independently wealthy was about to disappear. Not destroyed, but redirected to causes that would actually appreciate the sacrifice it represented. If Emma wanted to build her life with people who measured worth by social standing rather than love and dedication, she would do it without the financial foundation I'd spent my life creating for her. The drive home to Millbrook felt longer than usual, 3 hours of empty highway that gave me plenty of time to think about what had just happened. I'd raised Emma to be strong and independent, but somewhere along the way, she'd learned to value the wrong things. The daughter who'd once been proud of my work ethic and determination had become someone who saw me as an embarrassment to be hidden away. Maybe this was exactly the lesson she needed to learn. That real love and support couldn't be replaced by social connections and inherited wealth. That the people who would stand by you when things got difficult were worth more than all the country club memberships and designer dresses in the world. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex, I'd made peace with my decision. Emma had chosen her new family and their values over the woman who'd given her everything. Now she would live with the consequences of that choice. The trust fund would go to scholarships for young women whose mothers were working multiple jobs to pay for their education. At least those recipients would understand the value of sacrifice. I climbed the stairs to my modest apartment, hung up the navy dress that had seemed so important that morning, and poured myself a glass of wine. Outside my window, the lights of Millbrook twinkled peacefully, a quiet reminder that there were different kinds of wealth in this world. I'd spent 25 years building financial security for someone who didn't value it. Now it was time to find people who would. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages from Emma. Apparently, someone at the reception had mentioned something about a trust fund, and now she was desperate to reach me. I deleted every message without reading them, and made myself a cup of coffee. If Emma wanted to have a conversation with me, she was going to have to do better than a phone call. Richard Morrison's office was a study in understated elegance, all dark wood and leather-bound books that spoke of old money and established relationships. I'd been coming here for 15 years, ever since I'd first started building real wealth and needed professional guidance. Richard had watched my small accounting firm grow into something substantial, had helped me navigate investments and tax strategies that most people in my position never had access to. "Catherine," he said as I settled into the familiar chair across from his mahogany desk, "I have to ask if you're certain about this decision. The trust fund represents a significant portion of your assets." "I'm certain." I placed the wedding photos Emma had sent me over the years on his desk. Images of a young woman who'd gradually transformed from my loving daughter into someone I barely recognized. "She made her choice yesterday. This is mine." Richard nodded slowly. He'd been handling wealthy families, affairs long enough to understand that money often brought out the worst in people. "Where would you like the funds redirected?" "I want to establish a scholarship foundation for first-generation college students whose mothers are working to support their education. Women who understand the value of sacrifice because they're living it every day." As Richard began drawing up the paperwork, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. The money would still help young women build better futures, just not the young woman I'd originally intended. Sometimes the most loving thing you could do for someone was to let them face the consequences of their choices. Emma's calls continued throughout the week, growing more frantic as she began to understand what she'd lost. But I wasn't ready to talk to her yet. Not until she was ready to have a real conversation about what had happened at that wedding and why she'd chosen to humiliate the person who loved her most. The Scholarship Foundation would be my legacy now, a way to honor all the mothers who were working multiple jobs and sacrificing their own comfort for their children's futures. Emma had taught me an important lesson about the difference between loving someone and enabling their worst impulses. This was love, even if she couldn't see it yet. The papers were signed, the trust fund dissolved, and $12 million redirected to young women who would understand its true value. Emma had gotten exactly what she'd asked for at her wedding, a life without her embarrassing mother. Now she would have to build that life without the financial foundation she'd always taken for granted. Sometimes the most powerful response to being dismissed was simply walking away with your dignity intact. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, the person who dismissed you would eventually realize what they'd lost and find the courage to fight for it back. But that, as they say, would be entirely up to Emma. 3 weeks after the wedding, Emma finally showed up at my door. I was in my kitchen making dinner when I heard the familiar sound of her car pulling into the parking lot of my apartment complex. Through my window, I watched her sit in her new BMW for nearly 10 minutes before finally getting out and walking toward my building. She was wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater and designer jeans that probably cost more than my monthly rent, her hair professionally styled in a way that screamed expensive salon. When she knocked, I took my time answering. I'd been expecting this visit ever since Richard Morrison had sent the final paperwork confirming the trust fund dissolution. Emma had been calling daily, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails that I'd deleted without listening to completely. Her text messages had evolved from casual, "Can we talk?" to frantic, "Mom, please call me back, this is important," to yesterday's, "I know about the trust fund. We need to discuss this immediately." I opened the door to find my daughter looking more vulnerable than I'd seen her since she was a child. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the dark circles under her eyes, and her usual confident posture had been replaced by something that looked almost like fear. "Hello, Emma," I said calmly, not moving aside to let her in. "Mom." Her voice was smaller than I remembered. "Can I come in, please?" I stepped back and gestured toward the living room. Emma walked into my modest apartment with careful steps, as if seeing it for the first time. In reality, she hadn't visited in over 8 months, not since she'd moved in with Jonathan's family to plan the wedding. She perched on the edge of my secondhand sofa like she was afraid of getting too comfortable. "You look tired," I observed, settling into my favorite armchair with my cup of tea. I didn't offer her anything to drink. "I haven't been sleeping well." Emma twisted her wedding ring around her finger, a nervous habit she'd developed as a child. "Mom, I need to ask you about something. About money." "Oh?" I raised an eyebrow. "That's interesting. I seem to remember you telling me to leave your wedding because I was embarrassing you. What could you possibly need to discuss with someone so beneath your new social standing?" Emma's face flushed red. "That's not fair. You don't understand the pressure I was under that day. Jonathan's family has certain expectations, and I was trying to make everything perfect. Perfect. I repeated the word slowly. And having your mother present would have ruined that perfection? It's complicated. Emma stood up and began pacing my small living room. You don't know what it's like being married into a family like the Sterlings. Every move I make is scrutinized. Every person I associate with reflects on Jonathan's reputation, on the family business. So you decided I wasn't worthy of association. That's not what I meant. But even as she said it, Emma couldn't meet my eyes. Look, I heard something at the reception, after you left. Someone mentioned that you had set up some kind of trust fund for me. Is that true? There it was, the real reason for her visit. Not to apologize for her treatment of me, not to repair our damaged relationship, but to secure access to money she'd only just learned existed. Where did you hear that? I asked. Margaret Sterling mentioned it. She said she overheard you talking to someone on the phone about trust fund changes. She was concerned that there might be financial complications that could affect the family. Of course, Margaret Sterling was concerned. The woman who'd made it clear that I wasn't welcome in her son's life was suddenly very interested in any assets I might possess. It was fascinating how quickly attitudes could change when money entered the equation. I see. And what exactly did Mrs. Sterling suggest you do about these potential complications? Emma stopped pacing and faced me directly. She thought I should clarify the situation with you, make sure there weren't any misunderstandings that might impact the family's financial planning. The manipulation was so transparent it was almost insulting. Margaret Sterling had sent Emma here to gather intelligence about my assets, probably to determine whether I posed any threat to their carefully ordered world or represented an opportunity they needed to secure. Emma, sit down. My voice carried the authority I'd used when she was a teenager, and she responded automatically, sinking back onto the sofa. I want you to think very carefully about what you're asking me and why you're here. I just want to understand what's going on. You never told me you had money set aside for me. Why keep it secret? The same reason I kept many things secret. To protect you from people who might value you for the wrong reasons. I paused, studying her face. People like the Sterlings, apparently. The Sterlings aren't using me for money. Jonathan loves me. Does he? Tell me, Emma, what does Jonathan know about your background? About how I built my business from nothing after your father died? About the years I worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat? Emma's silence was telling. She'd clearly painted a very different picture of her upbringing for her new family. One that didn't include a mother who'd struggled to make ends meet, or the modest apartment complex where she'd grown up. I told him you were in accounting, she said finally. Accounting. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. That's certainly one way to describe building a business from a single client and a card table in our living room. What else did you tell him? That my father died when I was young, and you raised me alone. That we weren't wealthy, but we got by. We got by. Another interesting interpretation, and I suppose you neglected to mention the years you wore secondhand clothes, because I was investing every spare dollar in building something that would secure your future, or the nights I worked until dawn while you slept, building the client base that eventually became Wells Financial Consulting. Emma's face was growing paler with each question. I didn't think those details were important. You didn't think they were impressive enough for your new family. That's not true. Isn't it? Tell me, Emma. What story did you create about how you afforded college? About how you had enough financial stability to take unpaid internships while your classmates worked minimum wage jobs? About how you graduated debt-free while most of your friends will be paying student loans for decades? Each question hit its mark. Emma had always been intelligent enough to understand cause and effect. She'd simply chosen to ignore the connections when they became inconvenient for her new narrative. I worked hard in school, she said weakly. You did work hard, but you were able to focus on your studies because I made sure you never had to worry about basic necessities. You took that creative writing workshop in Italy the summer before your senior year because I had built enough financial stability to pay for it. You moved to the city after graduation and could afford to live alone while you found your footing because I had prepared for that transition. Emma was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. I never asked you to do those things. No, you never asked. Because that's what parents do, Emma. We sacrifice for our children's futures without being asked. We work extra hours and skip vacations and wear the same clothes for years, because we want our children to have opportunities we never had. So what was this trust fund? Some kind of test? The question revealed how little she understood about love and sacrifice. The trust fund was my legacy to you. $12 million that I spent 25 years accumulating, invested carefully, and grown strategically, all intended to give you complete financial independence by the time you turned 30. Emma's sharp intake of breath was audible. $12 million was clearly more than she'd imagined. $12 million? How did you manage to save that much? The same way I managed everything else in our lives, Emma. Through careful planning, strategic investments, and a work ethic that apparently embarrassed you enough to demand I leave your wedding. Mom, I didn't mean. You meant exactly what you said. In front of 200 people, you told me I was embarrassing you and ordered me to leave the most important day of your life. Because your new family had made it clear that I didn't meet their standards. Emma stood up again, her agitation obvious. You don't understand the position I was in. Margaret Sterling had been making comments all week about family backgrounds and appropriate associations. She kept asking questions about you, about our family's history, about whether there were any complications that might reflect poorly on Jonathan's career. And you decided the best way to handle her interrogation was to distance yourself from me completely. I was trying to protect both of us. If I hadn't managed the situation carefully, she might have convinced Jonathan to call off the wedding entirely. The admission hung in the air between us like a confession. Emma had been so desperate to secure her place in the Sterling family that she'd been willing to sacrifice our relationship to achieve it. So you chose them over me. I chose my future over the past. The words came out harsher than she'd probably intended, but they revealed her true feelings with devastating clarity. I set down my teacup and looked at my daughter with clear eyes. This wasn't the child I'd raised, the young woman who'd once been proud of my accomplishments and grateful for my sacrifices. This was someone who'd learned to view relationships as transactions and family as a burden to be managed. I see. And now that you've chosen your future, what exactly do you want from me? I want to know about the trust fund. Margaret says there are legal implications to consider, tax consequences that could affect the family's financial planning. Margaret says. I repeated her words slowly. Emma, do you hear yourself? You're sitting in your mother's living room, discussing your inheritance, and you're more concerned about Margaret Sterling's opinion than about repairing the damage you've done to our relationship. That's not true. I care about us. But I also have to think practically about the future. Jonathan and I are planning to buy a house next year, and we're talking about starting a family. If there's money available that could help with those goals. Money that could help with your goals. I stood up and walked to my kitchen, needing distance from the conversation. Emma, do you have any idea what you sound like right now? She followed me, her heels clicking on my linoleum floor. I sound like someone who's trying to plan responsibly for her future. Someone who's just learned that her mother has been hiding significant assets for years. You sound like Margaret Sterling. Like someone who views family relationships as financial opportunities to be maximized. That's not fair. Fair? I turned to face her, and she took a step back at whatever she saw in my expression. Let me tell you what's not fair, Emma. What's not fair is working 70-hour weeks for 25 years to build security for someone who grows up to be ashamed of your efforts. What's not fair is being dismissed from your only child's wedding because you don't fit the image she wants to project. I wasn't ashamed of you. You told me I was embarrassing you. In front of everyone. You ordered me to leave. I was stressed. It was my wedding day, and everything had to be perfect. Perfect. There was that word again. And I was the imperfection that needed to be removed. Emma's composure finally cracked. Tears began streaming down her face, smearing her carefully applied makeup. I'm sorry, okay? I'm sorry I hurt your feelings. But I can't change what happened at the wedding. I can only try to move forward and rebuild our relationship. Rebuild our relationship, I repeated. Is that what this is? Because it seems to me like you're here to secure access to money that Margaret Sterling thinks should be part of your financial planning. The money is mine, isn't it? You said it was a trust fund for me. And there it was, the entitlement that had been lurking beneath her apologies and explanations. Emma believed she was owed the money I'd spent decades accumulating, regardless of how she'd treated me or what she'd prioritized in her life. The money was intended for you, I said carefully. Past tense. Emma went very still. What do you mean, past tense? I mean that after your wedding, after you made it clear that I was an embarrassment you needed to distance yourself from, I made some changes to my estate planning. What kind of changes? I returned to the living room and retrieved a folder from my desk drawer. Inside were copies of all the paperwork Richard Morrison had prepared, documentation of the trust fund's dissolution, and the establishment of the Scholarship Foundation. I handed the folder to Emma and watched her face as she read. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. The color drained from her cheeks as she read about the $12 million that had been redirected away from her and toward scholarships for first-generation college students. Her hands began to shake as she reached the section detailing the selection criteria, young women whose mothers were working to support their education, who understood the value of sacrifice and family loyalty. You gave away my inheritance, she whispered. I redirected money that I earned and saved according to my own priorities. To strangers. You gave $12 million to strangers instead of your own daughter. I gave it to young women who will appreciate the sacrifice it represents, who won't be embarrassed by the mothers who worked to provide for their futures. Emma sank back onto the sofa, still clutching the papers. You can't do this. There must be legal ways to challenge this decision. You're welcome to consult with attorneys, though I should mention that Richard Morrison has been handling estate law for 30 years. He's quite thorough in his documentation. This is insane. You're punishing me for one bad day, for one mistake. This isn't punishment, Emma. This is a natural consequence of the choices you've made and the values you've embraced. She looked up at me with desperate eyes. What about Jonathan's family? What am I supposed to tell them? Margaret has been asking about family assets, about what kind of financial foundation I bring to the marriage. I suggest you tell them the truth, that your mother worked hard to build a successful business and chose to direct her assets toward charitable causes, rather than enabling a daughter who values social standing over family relationships. They'll think I lied to them about my background. Did you lie to them about your background? Emma's silence was answer enough. She'd clearly created a fictional version of our family's story, one that was more palatable to the Sterling family's expectations but bore little resemblance to reality. What do you want me to do? She asked finally. How do I fix this? You start by deciding what's actually important to you. Is it the approval of people who judge you based on your family's wealth? Or is it having authentic relationships with people who love you, regardless of your financial status? It's not that simple. You don't understand the world I'm living in now. I understand it perfectly. I've spent 25 years building wealth in that same world, dealing with clients who measured success by bank account balances and social connections. The difference is that I never forgot where I came from or what really mattered. Emma stood up abruptly, clutching the papers to her chest. I need time to think about this. This is all happening too fast. Take all the time you need. But understand that the trust fund is gone, Emma. That decision is final. What happens next depends entirely on what you choose to prioritize going forward. After she left, I sat in my quiet apartment and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Complete peace with my decisions. Emma would either learn to value the things that truly mattered, or she would continue down the path she'd chosen at her wedding. Either way, she would face the consequences of her choices without the financial cushion I'd spent my life building. The Scholarship Foundation would begin accepting applications next month. I'd already received dozens of inquiries from young women whose stories reminded me of my own struggles as a single mother trying to provide for my child's future. These recipients would understand the value of sacrifice because they were living it every day. Over the following days, Emma called repeatedly, but I let her voicemails go unanswered. She needed time to process what she'd learned and decide what kind of person she wanted to be going forward. The next move would have to come from her, and it would need to demonstrate a genuine understanding of what she'd lost and why. Meanwhile, Margaret Sterling had apparently shared the news of the dissolved trust fund with her social circle, because I began receiving calls from financial advisors and estate attorneys who'd heard that a substantial inheritance had been redirected to charity. They were eager to discuss my philanthropic goals and suggest ways to maximize tax benefits from my charitable giving. The irony wasn't lost on me. Now that I'd proven I had significant assets to distribute, suddenly everyone wanted to cultivate a relationship with the woman who'd been deemed too embarrassing for Emma's wedding reception. 2 weeks after our confrontation, Emma appeared at my door again. This time she wasn't alone. Jonathan stood beside her, looking uncomfortable in his expensive suit and perfectly styled hair. He was even more handsome than he'd appeared at the wedding, with the kind of polished confidence that came from never having to worry about money. "Mrs. Wells," he said, extending his hand, "I was hoping we could have a conversation." I invited them both inside, noting that Emma looked exhausted. Her designer clothes couldn't hide the weight she'd lost, or the strain that was evident in every line of her posture. "Thank you for seeing us," Jonathan continued once we were all seated. "Emma has explained the situation with the trust fund, and I wanted to discuss it with you directly." "I see. And what exactly did Emma tell you about the situation?" Jonathan glanced at his wife before responding. "She said there was a misunderstanding at the wedding that led to some changes in your estate planning. We're hoping we can resolve whatever issues arose and restore the original arrangements." His tone was diplomatic but condescending, the voice of someone accustomed to solving problems through negotiation and compromise. He clearly believed this was a simple matter of hurt feelings that could be smoothed over with the right approach. "There was no misunderstanding," I said calmly. "Emma made her priorities very clear at your wedding. I simply adjusted my financial planning to reflect those priorities." "Mrs. Wells, I think there may have been some miscommunication about our family's expectations. We certainly never intended to make you feel unwelcome." "No? Then please explain why I was seated at table 9 while distant acquaintances sat with the family. Explain why your mother spent the evening making it clear that I didn't belong in your social circle. Explain why Emma felt the need to order me to leave rather than risk further embarrassment." Jonathan's composed expression faltered slightly. "My mother can be particular about social protocols. But that doesn't reflect how Emma and I feel about family relationships, doesn't it?" Because from where I was sitting, Emma seemed very comfortable with her decision to prioritize your mother's approval over her relationship with me. Emma finally spoke up, her voice strained. "Mom, I've apologized for what happened at the wedding. I've admitted I made mistakes. What more do you want from me? I want you to understand the difference between apologizing for hurting my feelings and taking responsibility for the choices you made. I want you to recognize that this isn't about one bad day, but about the person you've become and the values you've embraced." Jonathan leaned forward, clearly trying to take control of the conversation. "Mrs. Wells, I think we're all committed to moving forward positively. Emma loves you, and we want you to be part of our family. Perhaps we could discuss ways to restore the trust fund, while also addressing any concerns you have about our relationship." The presumption in his words was staggering. He was actually suggesting that I could buy my way back into Emma's life by reversing my financial decisions. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice growing colder, "let me be very clear about something. The trust fund wasn't a tool for manipulating family relationships. It was a gift I intended to give freely to a daughter who valued the sacrifice it represented. That daughter no longer exists." "What do you mean?" Emma asked. "I mean that the young woman I raised would never have been embarrassed by her mother's presence at her wedding. She would never have ordered me to leave the most important day of her life to appease people who judge others by their bank account balances. She would never have hidden her family's true story to fit into a world that values appearance over authenticity." Emma's face crumpled. "I'm still that person. I just got confused for a while. The pressure of fitting into Jonathan's world, of meeting his family's expectations, it made me act in ways that weren't really me." "Were they?" "Because the woman who sat in this apartment 2 weeks ago seemed very comfortable with her decision to prioritize social standing over family loyalty. She seemed quite clear about viewing our relationship as a liability to be managed." Jonathan's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Mrs. Wells, with all due respect, You're putting Emma in an impossible position. She's trying to build a life with my family while maintaining her relationship with you. Sometimes compromises have to be made. Compromises. I stood up and walked to my window, looking out at the modest neighborhood where I'd chosen to live, despite having the means to afford something much more expensive. Tell me, Mr. Sterling, what compromises have you made for this relationship? What have you sacrificed to accommodate Emma's background, or my place in her life? His silence was telling. In his world, compromise was something other people did to fit into his family's expectations, not something he did to honor his wife's relationships. I thought so. I turned back to face them both. Emma, you asked what I want from you. I want you to decide who you really are and what you actually value. Are you the young woman I raised, who understood that family loyalty and authentic relationships matter more than social approval? Or are you the person you've become since joining the Sterling family? Someone who views her own mother as an embarrassment to be hidden away. I don't want to hide you away, Emma protested. I want us to have a relationship. I just need you to understand that my life is more complicated now. Your life is exactly as complicated as you choose to make it. You can either stand up for what matters to you, or you can continue letting other people's expectations dictate your choices. But you can't do both. Jonathan stood up, clearly frustrated with the direction of the conversation. Mrs. Wells, I think we're going in circles here. Emma, and I came here in good faith to repair this relationship. If you're not willing to meet us halfway, then perhaps we should reconsider whether ongoing contact is beneficial for anyone. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. He was suggesting that continued conflict with me might result in Emma being cut off from our relationship entirely. It was exactly the kind of manipulation I'd expected from someone who'd been raised to believe that money and social position gave him the right to control other people's choices. Mr. Sterling, I said quietly, are you actually threatening to prevent my daughter from seeing me if I don't restore her inheritance? I'm suggesting that family relationships should be based on mutual respect and consideration, not financial coercion. The irony of his statement was breathtaking. He was accusing me of financial coercion while simultaneously threatening to limit Emma's contact with me if I didn't restore access to money his family wanted to control. Emma, I said, looking directly at my daughter, do you hear what your husband just said? Do you understand what kind of ultimatum he's giving you? Emma looked between Jonathan and me with growing panic. This doesn't have to be an ultimatum. We can work this out. We can find a solution that works for everyone. No, Emma, we can't. Because the solution Jonathan wants requires me to pretend that what happened at your wedding was acceptable. It requires me to restore financial rewards for behavior that demonstrated a complete lack of respect for our relationship. The money was never supposed to be a reward or punishment, Emma said desperately. It was supposed to be an inheritance, a gift from mother to daughter. It was supposed to be my legacy to a daughter who would honor the sacrifice it represented. A daughter who would never be ashamed of the woman who worked to provide for her future. Jonathan checked his watch with obvious impatience. Mrs. Wells, we can't change what happened at the wedding. We can only move forward from here. Are you willing to do that, or should we consider this relationship permanently damaged? The ultimatum was now explicit. Restore the money or lose access to Emma entirely. It was exactly the kind of manipulation I'd spent 25 years trying to protect her from. Emma, I said one final time, you have a choice to make. You can stand up to the people who are trying to control your relationship with your mother. Or you can let them succeed. But understand that if you choose to let financial considerations dictate family relationships, you're becoming exactly the kind of person I spent my life trying to protect you from. Emma sat in silence for a long moment, tears streaming down her face. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. I need the money, Mom. Jonathan's family has expectations about the kind of financial foundation I bring to the marriage. If I can't meet those expectations... She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. The message was clear. Her place in the Sterling family depended on bringing assets to the relationship, and she was willing to sacrifice our relationship to secure those assets. Then you've made your choice, I said quietly. And now you'll live with the consequences. After they left, I called Richard Morrison to confirm that all the legal documentation was secure and irreversible. The Scholarship Foundation was now fully operational, and the first grants would be awarded within the month. 20 young women would receive funding for their education, women whose mothers were working multiple jobs and making daily sacrifices for their daughters' futures. Emma had chosen money and social standing over family loyalty. She would have to learn to live with that decision. But at least the money I'd spent my life accumulating would go to young women who understood its true value. 6 months passed before I heard from Emma again. During that time, I threw myself into the Scholarship Foundation with the same intensity I'd once applied to building my business. The Wells Foundation for Educational Excellence had received over 300 applications in its first round, each one a story of determination and sacrifice that reminded me why I'd made the decision to redirect the trust fund. I spent hours reading through applications from young women across the country. Maria Gonzalez from Phoenix, whose mother cleaned office buildings at night to pay for her community college courses. Ashley Chen from Detroit, whose mother worked double shifts at a factory while studying English as a second language to better support her daughter's dreams of becoming a doctor. These were the daughters of women who understood what real sacrifice looked like, who wouldn't be embarrassed by mothers who worked with their hands or spoke with accents or lived in modest neighborhoods. The Foundation's first award ceremony was held at the Riverside Community Center, the same venue where I'd started my business 25 years earlier. 20 young women stood on the small stage, each holding a certificate representing full tuition assistance for their college education. Their mothers sat in the front rows, many of them still wearing work uniforms because they'd come straight from their jobs to witness this moment. I thought about Emma constantly during the ceremony, wondering if she would have appreciated the significance of what was happening here. These mothers had worked multiple jobs, missed family gatherings, and worn the same clothes for years to give their daughters opportunities they'd never had. None of their daughters would ever tell them they were embarrassing. None of them would order their mothers to leave the most important moments of their lives. The local newspaper covered the event, running a feature story about the foundation and my decision to redirect my estate toward educational philanthropy. The article mentioned that I was the mother of Emma Sterling, noting that Mrs. Sterling had not been available for comment about her mother's charitable work. The absence of any statement from Emma spoke volumes about the continued distance between us. 2 weeks after the newspaper article ran, Margaret Sterling called my office. Her voice on the phone was crisp and businesslike, though I detected an undercurrent of something that might have been desperation. "Mrs. Wells, this is Margaret Sterling. I was hoping we could arrange a meeting to discuss some family matters." "What kind of family matters, Mrs. Sterling? I think it would be better if we discussed this in person. Are you available for lunch this week? I could meet you at the country club." The country club where Emma's wedding had been held, where I'd been made to feel so unwelcome that my own daughter had ordered me to leave. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. "I'm quite busy with foundation work this week. Perhaps you could tell me what this is about?" There was a pause before Margaret spoke again, and when she did, her tone had shifted slightly. "Mrs. Wells, I think there may have been some misunderstandings about the family dynamics during Emma and Jonathan's wedding. I'd like an opportunity to clarify things and perhaps discuss how we might move forward more constructively." "I see. And what prompted this sudden interest in clarification?" Another pause. "Emma is struggling. The situation with the trust fund has created some complications that are affecting her marriage and her place in our family. I thought perhaps we could find a way to resolve these issues that would benefit everyone involved." There it was. Emma's marriage was in trouble, probably because the Sterling family had discovered that she'd brought no financial assets to the relationship and had, in fact, cost them access to a $12 million inheritance through her behavior at the wedding. "Mrs. Sterling, if Emma is struggling, perhaps she should be the one calling me. She's too proud to reach out directly. And frankly, I think this situation has escalated beyond what either of you can resolve, without some outside perspective." Outside perspective. From the woman who'd spent Emma's wedding reception, making it clear that I wasn't welcome in their social circle. The audacity was remarkable. "I appreciate your concern, but I don't think there's anything for us to discuss. Emma made her choice at the wedding, and I've made mine with regard to my estate planning. Mrs. Wells, please. I'm asking for one lunch meeting. Surely you can spare 2 hours for the sake of your daughter's happiness." The manipulation was subtle, but unmistakable. She was trying to make me feel guilty for Emma's problems, while carefully avoiding any acknowledgement of her own role in creating the situation. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her the following Thursday at a small restaurant downtown, not at the country club. If Margaret Sterling wanted to have this conversation, it would be on neutral ground. The restaurant was a quiet place I'd chosen specifically because it was the kind of establishment that served good food without pretension. Margaret arrived 15 minutes late, probably hoping to establish some kind of psychological advantage through the power play. She was dressed immaculately in a designer suit that cost more than most people made in a month, her jewelry sparkling under the restaurant's modest lighting. "Mrs. Wells, thank you so much for meeting with me." She slid into the booth across from me with practiced grace. "I hope you don't mind that I took the liberty of ordering wine for the table." I hadn't planned to drink, but I accepted the glass she poured, curious to see how she intended to approach this conversation. "You mentioned that Emma is struggling," I said without preamble. "What kind of struggles are we talking about?" Margaret took a careful sip of wine before responding. "She's been having difficulty adjusting to married life. The stress of the wedding, the changes in family dynamics, the discovery of the trust fund situation. It's all been quite overwhelming for her." "The discovery of the trust fund situation," I repeated. "You mean the discovery that her behavior at the wedding cost her a $12 million inheritance?" "I mean the discovery that financial arrangements she was counting on are no longer available. Emma had made certain assumptions about her future security that are no longer valid." The careful phrasing revealed everything. Emma hadn't just assumed she would inherit money. She'd been counting on it to meet expectations that the Sterling family had set for her financial contribution to the marriage. "What kind of assumptions?" Margaret set down her wine glass and leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Wells, when Jonathan married Emma, our family expected that she would bring certain assets to the relationship. Not because we're mercenary, but because financial stability is important for a successful marriage. When we learned about the trust fund, we were pleased that Emma would be able to contribute to their shared future. And now that the trust fund has been redirected to charity, now there are complications. Jonathan's career requires certain social obligations, certain lifestyle expenses. Emma is struggling to meet those expectations without the financial foundation she had expected to have." I studied Margaret's face, noting the carefully controlled expression that didn't quite hide her underlying anxiety. "Mrs. Sterling, are you telling me that Emma's marriage is in trouble because she can't contribute financially to maintaining your family's lifestyle?" "I'm telling you that young marriages face many challenges, and financial stress can be particularly damaging. Emma is feeling pressure to justify her place in our family when she's unable to contribute in the ways that were anticipated." The admission was more revealing than Margaret probably intended. Emma wasn't just struggling financially. She was struggling to prove her worth to a family that measured value in dollars and social connections. "What exactly are you asking me to do about this situation?" Margaret straightened in her seat, preparing to make her pitch. "I'm asking you to consider restoring the trust fund. Not necessarily the full amount, but enough to give Emma the security she needs to build a successful marriage." "And in exchange?" "In exchange, Emma would have the financial foundation to fully participate in our family's social obligations. She could contribute to their household expenses, support Jonathan's career development, perhaps even expand her own professional opportunities." It was a business proposal disguised as concern for Emma's well-being. Margaret was essentially asking me to pay for Emma's continued membership in the Sterling family. "Mrs. Sterling, let me ask you something. If Emma had never had any expectation of inheritance, if she'd married Jonathan with only her own earnings, and whatever modest gifts I might have provided as a normal parent, would your family have accepted her?" The question clearly made Margaret uncomfortable. "Of course we would have. We love Emma for who she is. But financial compatibility is important in marriage. Jonathan was raised with certain expectations about lifestyle and social obligations. It's difficult for him to adjust those expectations after the fact. So Emma is expected to fund the lifestyle Jonathan was raised to expect, even though she wasn't raised with the same financial advantages. Marriage is about partnership. about both people contributing to their shared goals. And what has Jonathan contributed to accommodate Emma's background? What adjustments has he made to include her family in their social circle? Margaret's pause was telling. Jonathan has been very patient with the situation. He understands that family dynamics can be complicated. Patient. As if accepting Emma despite her embarrassing mother was some kind of generous accommodation on his part. Mrs. Sterling, I think we have very different ideas about what marriage should look like. I believe it should be based on love, mutual respect, and shared values. You seem to believe it should be based on financial transactions and social positioning. I believe it should be based on practical considerations that support long-term happiness. Romantic love is wonderful, but it doesn't pay for mortgages or children's educations or the kind of social obligations that support professional advancement. Emma had a good job before she married Jonathan. She was financially independent and building her own career. What happened to that? She left her position to focus on family obligations and supporting Jonathan's career development. It's a temporary sacrifice that will benefit both of them in the long run. Emma had given up her independence to become financially dependent on a family that now questioned her value because she couldn't contribute the inheritance they'd expected. The trap was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. So Emma is now entirely dependent on Jonathan's income and your family's approval for her financial security. She's part of a family that supports each other toward common goals. And if she fails to meet your family's expectations? If she can't contribute financially or socially in the ways you require? Margaret's mask slipped slightly, revealing the steel underneath her polished exterior. Then perhaps she needs to reconsider whether this marriage is sustainable for everyone involved. There it was, the threat that had probably been hanging over Emma's head since the trust fund discovery. Conform to the Sterling family's expectations or risk losing her marriage entirely. You're asking me to pay $12 million to prevent your family from destroying my daughter's marriage. I'm asking you to provide the financial foundation that Emma needs to build a successful life with the man she loves. The man who married her expecting she would bring assets to subsidize his lifestyle. The man who married her believing she could be a true partner in building their future together. I finished my wine and set the glass down carefully. Mrs. Sterling, I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about my relationship with Emma and my obligations to your family. What kind of misunderstanding? You seem to believe that I should fund Emma's membership in your social circle to prevent her marriage from failing. I believe that if Emma's marriage can only survive with my financial support, then it was never a marriage worth having. Margaret's composure finally cracked completely. Mrs. Wells, you're being deliberately obtuse. This isn't about funding social memberships. This is about giving your daughter the tools she needs to succeed in the life she's chosen. The life she chose when she ordered me to leave her wedding because I was embarrassing her in front of your family. That was a mistake made under pressure. Emma regrets what happened that day. Does she? Because when she came to my apartment to discuss the trust fund, she seemed more concerned about meeting your family's financial expectations than about repairing our relationship. She was trying to solve multiple problems at once. That doesn't mean she doesn't love you or want a relationship with you. Then why isn't she here having this conversation herself? Margaret was quiet for a moment, clearly debating how much to reveal. Because she's ashamed. She knows she made mistakes, and she's afraid you'll reject any attempt she makes to reconcile. So she sent you to negotiate the terms of our relationship based on financial arrangements. She sent me to find a solution that could work for everyone. I stood up and placed enough money on the table to cover both our meals and a generous tip. Mrs. Sterling, here's the solution that works for everyone. Emma decides whether she wants a relationship with her mother based on love and respect, not financial transactions. Jonathan decides whether he wants a wife who will stand up for her family, or a wife who will sacrifice anyone and anything to maintain social standing. And you decide whether you want a daughter-in-law who contributes to your family through character and integrity, or one who contributes through inherited wealth. Where does that leave Emma? It leaves Emma free to choose what kind of person she wants to be and what kind of relationships she wants to have. The same choice I offered her at her wedding, and the same choice I'm offering now. Margaret stood as well, her frustration evident. And if she chooses poorly, if she loses her marriage because she can't meet the practical requirements of the life she's built, Then she'll learn that some prices are too high to pay, even for social acceptance. And maybe she'll finally understand what her mother tried to teach her about the difference between people who love you for who you are and people who love you for what you can provide. I left Margaret sitting in that restaurant, probably planning her next move in the campaign to restore Emma's inheritance. But the conversation had clarified something important for me. Emma's struggles weren't just about money. They were about her willingness to sacrifice everything authentic about herself to maintain a place in a family that valued her only for her potential financial contributions. 3 days later, Emma appeared at my door again. This time she was alone, and she looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. Her designer clothes hung loosely on her frame, and her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked more like the daughter I remembered from her college years than the polished society wife she'd become. "Mom," she said when I opened the door, "I know Margaret talked to you. I know she asked you to restore the trust fund." "She did. And?" "And I told her the same thing I told you. The money is gone, Emma. It's been donated to young women who will appreciate the sacrifice it represents." Emma's face crumpled, but she didn't break down this time. Instead, she seemed to deflate, as if she'd been holding on to hope that was finally exhausted. "Can I come in? Please? I have something I need to tell you." I stepped aside and let her enter. She walked to my kitchen table and sat down heavily, looking around the modest space as if seeing it for the first time. "I've been thinking about what you said, about choosing what kind of person I want to be, about the difference between people who love you for who you are and people who love you for what you can provide." I sat down across from her and waited. I think Jonathan's family only accepted me because they thought I came with money. And I think Jonathan only proposed because his mother convinced him I was a good investment for his future. The admission couldn't have been easy for her to make. "What makes you think that?" "Things he's said since we found out about the trust fund. Comments about how I misrepresented my family's financial situation. Questions about whether I deliberately hid information about my inheritance to trap him into marriage." "And what do you think?" Emma was quiet for a long moment. "I think I misrepresented everything about my background because I was ashamed of who I really was. I was ashamed that my mother worked multiple jobs to pay for my education. I was ashamed that we lived in a small apartment instead of a big house. I was ashamed that you wore the same dress to every important event because you were saving money for my future." Her voice broke on the last words, and tears began streaming down her face. I was so desperate to fit into Jonathan's world that I convinced myself our background was something to hide instead of something to be proud of. And when you showed up at my wedding, representing everything I was trying to escape from, I panicked. "Emma, no, let me finish. I need to say this." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "You worked your entire life to give me opportunities you never had. You sacrificed everything to make sure I could go to college, could move to the city, could build whatever life I wanted. And when I finally had the chance to honor that sacrifice, to introduce you to my new family as the amazing woman who made my success possible, I failed. You were under pressure. I was a coward. I chose the approval of people I barely knew over the woman who loved me enough to work 70-hour weeks for my future. I chose social acceptance over family loyalty. I chose to be embarrassed by the person I should have been most proud of." The pain in her voice was devastating, but it was also real in a way that her previous apologies hadn't been. This wasn't about money or social positioning. This was about genuine recognition of what she'd lost. "What are you saying, Emma?" "I'm saying that I understand why you dissolved the trust fund. I'm saying that I don't deserve the money you spent your life accumulating, because I proved that I don't understand its value. I'm saying that those scholarship recipients will honor your sacrifice in ways I never did." I reached across the table and took her hand. "Emma, you're my daughter. I love you regardless of the mistakes you've made. But do you forgive me? Not for the money, but for betraying everything you taught me about what really matters?" The question hung between us, carrying the weight of months of pain and disappointment. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw something I hadn't seen since before she'd met Jonathan. Humility. Genuine remorse. Recognition of what she'd lost and why. "Yes," I said quietly, "I forgive you." Emma broke down completely then, sobbing with relief and grief for everything that had been damaged between us. I moved around the table and held her while she cried, feeling some of the walls I'd built around my heart beginning to crumble. "What happens now?" she asked when the tears finally subsided. "Now you decide what kind of life you want to build going forward. Do you want to stay married to a man whose family only values you for your financial contributions? Do you want to continue living in a world where your worth is measured by your bank account balance?" "I don't know. It's the only life I've built for myself in the past 3 years. If I leave Jonathan, I don't have anywhere to go. I gave up my job, my apartment, my independence. I have nothing. You have your education. You have your skills and intelligence and work ethic. You have everything I tried to give you that can't be taken away by other people's expectations. And I have you?" I squeezed her hand. "You've always had me, Emma. Even when you didn't want me, even when you were embarrassed by me, you had me. That's what mothers do. We love our children, even when they make choices that break our hearts." Emma stayed for dinner that night, helping me cook a simple meal in my small kitchen. We talked about her childhood, about the sacrifices I'd made that she'd never fully understood, about the pressure she'd felt to transform herself into someone worthy of the Sterling family's approval. "I keep thinking about that scholarship ceremony," she said as we were cleaning up. "About those mothers who were so proud of their daughters' achievements. I want to be the kind of daughter who makes you proud like that, not the kind who's embarrassed by where she came from." "You can be, Emma, but it means making some difficult choices about what you're willing to sacrifice for other people's approval." Over the following weeks, Emma began the process of reclaiming her life. She met with divorce attorneys to understand her options and discover that Jonathan's family had insisted on a prenuptial agreement that would leave her with very little if the marriage ended. She reached out to former colleagues about potential job opportunities, slowly rebuilding the professional network she'd abandoned when she married into the Sterling family. The process wasn't easy. Margaret Sterling launched a campaign to convince Emma that she was making a terrible mistake, that financial security and social position were more important than abstract principles about authenticity and family loyalty. Jonathan alternated between pleading with her to reconsider and threatening that she would regret throwing away the life they'd built together. But Emma had finally learned to recognize manipulation for what it was. She'd seen how quickly the Sterling family's affection had evaporated when she couldn't provide the financial contributions they expected. She'd experienced firsthand the conditional nature of relationships based on social and economic advantage. 6 months after our reconciliation, Emma filed for divorce. The legal proceedings were messy and public, with the Sterling family attempting to paint her as a gold digger who'd misrepresented her financial background to trap their son into marriage. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew the real story. But Emma handled the scrutiny with grace and dignity that reminded me of the young woman I'd raised. She gave interviews to sympathetic journalists about the pressure young women face to transform themselves for social acceptance. She spoke candidly about her mistakes and the importance of staying true to your values, even when it meant losing relationships that seemed important. The Scholarship Foundation received a flood of new donations after Emma's story became public. Apparently, there were many people who understood the value of authentic family relationships and wanted to support young women who were facing the same pressures Emma had succumbed to. Emma moved back to Millbrook after the divorce was finalized, renting a small apartment not far from mine while she rebuilt her life and career. We had dinner together twice a week, slowly repairing the damage that had been done to our relationship. She got a job with a nonprofit organization that provided financial literacy education to low-income families, work that reminded her daily of the values I'd tried to teach her. One evening, as we were walking through downtown Millbrook after dinner, Emma stopped suddenly and turned to me. "Mom, I need to ask you something." "What is it?" "Do you ever regret dissolving the trust fund? Do you ever wish you'd found a way to help me without sacrificing the money you'd worked so hard to accumulate?" I thought about the question carefully. The money was gone, redirected to young women who would use it to build authentic lives based on their own efforts and their mothers' sacrifices. Emma was starting over at 32, building a new career and learning to value relationships based on character rather than financial advantage. "No. I said finally. I don't regret it. That money was always meant to help you build a meaningful life. It's just that I had to learn that sometimes the most meaningful life requires starting over and choosing different values than the ones you thought you wanted. Emma smiled, and for the first time in years, it was the same smile I remembered from her childhood. Genuine, unguarded, free from the careful calculation that had marked her interactions during her marriage to Jonathan. I love you, Mom. Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I gave up on myself. I love you too, sweetheart, and I'm proud of the woman you're becoming. As we walked home together through the quiet streets of Millbrook, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before Emma's wedding. Complete peace with my choices and genuine hope for our future together. The trust fund was gone, but Emma had found something more valuable. She'd found her way back to the person I'd raised her to be. Someone who understood that the most important inheritance wasn't money, but the values and character that would guide her through whatever challenges life might bring. The scholarship recipients would graduate college debt-free and build careers based on their own efforts and their mother's sacrifices. Emma would build a new life based on authentic relationships and work that reflected her real values. And I would continue supporting young women who understood that the greatest gift a mother could give her daughter wasn't financial security, but the strength to choose character over convenience, authenticity over approval, and love over social advantage. Sometimes the most loving thing you could do for someone was to let them face the consequences of their choices until they learned to make better ones. Sometimes protecting someone meant refusing to enable their worst impulses, even when it broke your heart to watch them struggle. But sometimes, if you were patient enough and strong enough to hold your ground, the people you loved would find their way back to the values that really mattered. And sometimes, the relationships that survived that kind of testing became stronger than they'd ever been before. Emma had learned that some prices were too high to pay for social acceptance. I had learned that unconditional love sometimes required setting conditions on financial support. Together we were building a relationship based on mutual respect, shared values, and the kind of love that didn't require anyone to hide who they really were or where they came from. The trust fund was gone, but the trust between us was stronger than ever. And that, I realized, was the inheritance that truly mattered. The phone rang at exactly 7 in the morning, 3 months after Emma's divorce was finalized. I recognized the number immediately, though I hadn't heard from Margaret Sterling since our disastrous lunch meeting nearly a year earlier. Her voice was strained when I answered, lacking the polished confidence that had characterized our previous interactions. Mrs. Wells, this is Margaret Sterling. I'm calling because there's been a development that I think you should know about. I set down my coffee cup and braced myself for whatever manipulation she was about to attempt. What kind of development, Mrs. Sterling? It's about Jonathan. He's been having some difficulties since the divorce, and I'm afraid he's made some poor decisions that have affected our family's financial situation. The carefully chosen words couldn't hide the desperation underneath. Something had gone seriously wrong in the Sterling family's perfect world, and Margaret was reaching out to the woman she'd once dismissed as socially inadequate. I'm sorry to hear that, but I'm not sure why you're calling me about Jonathan's problems. Because they're connected to Emma, to the marriage, to decisions that were made based on expectations about financial arrangements that didn't materialize. There it was. Jonathan's troubles were somehow related to the trust fund that no longer existed, the inheritance that had been redirected to scholarship recipients who actually appreciated its value. Mrs. Sterling, I think you need to be more specific about what you're telling me. Margaret was quiet for a moment, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. Jonathan made some investments based on the assumption that Emma would bring substantial assets to their marriage. When those assets weren't available, he borrowed against future expectations. He borrowed money expecting to repay it with Emma's inheritance. He borrowed money expecting to invest it alongside Emma's trust fund in opportunities that would benefit both their futures. When the trust fund was dissolved, those investment strategies became problematic. The euphemisms were fascinating. Jonathan had apparently leveraged his family's assets based on money that didn't belong to him, money that had never been promised to him, money that existed only in his family's entitled assumptions about what Emma should bring to their marriage. How problematic are we talking about? Problematic enough that our family is facing some financial difficulties. Problematic enough that Jonathan's business partnerships are being questioned. problematic enough that we're having to make some difficult decisions about our future. I almost laughed at the irony. The Sterling family, who had spent Emma's wedding reception making it clear that I wasn't wealthy enough to deserve a place at their table, was now facing financial ruin because they'd built their plans around money I'd earned and saved and chosen to give to more deserving recipients. Mrs. Sterling, I'm still not understanding why you're calling me about this. Because I think there may have been some misunderstandings about the dissolution of Emma's trust fund. Perhaps if we could discuss the situation more thoroughly, we might find a way to address some of these complications. She was asking me to bail out the family that had rejected me, to restore money they felt entitled to despite having never earned it or appreciated the sacrifice it represented. The audacity was breathtaking. There were no misunderstandings, Mrs. Sterling. Emma chose to prioritize your family's approval over her relationship with me, and I chose to redirect my assets accordingly. Those decisions were made deliberately and with full understanding of their implications. But surely you can see that Emma has paid for her mistakes. She's lost her marriage, her social position, her financial security. Hasn't she suffered enough for one error in judgment? The attempt to make me feel guilty for Emma's consequences was predictable but ineffective. Emma hadn't suffered because of my decision. She'd suffered because she'd married into a family that valued her only for her potential financial contributions. Emma has learned valuable lessons about authentic relationships and personal integrity. I consider that growth, not suffering. And what about Jonathan? What about our family? We made plans based on reasonable expectations about Emma's background. You made plans based on assumptions about money that was never yours. The fact that those plans have created problems for your family isn't my responsibility. Margaret's composure finally cracked completely. Mrs. Wells, we're talking about losing everything. Our home, our business interests, our social position. All because of expectations that seemed reasonable at the time. Expectations based on what, exactly? Emma never promised to bring money to the marriage. I never promised to provide financial support to your family. You simply assumed that anyone marrying your son would come with assets you could control. We assumed that Emma's family background included the kind of financial stability that would support a marriage at our social level. You assumed that because you couldn't imagine anyone achieving professional success without inherited wealth. You couldn't conceive of someone building their own assets through hard work and strategic planning. That's not fair. What's not fair is a family that judges people based on their bank account balances, rather than their character. What's not fair is expecting someone else's money to subsidize your lifestyle choices. Margaret was crying now, though trying to hide it. Mrs. Wells, I'm asking for help. Not just for our family, but for Emma's future. If Jonathan declares bankruptcy, if our family loses everything, it will reflect on her as well. She'll be associated with financial scandal, social disgrace. Emma has already survived social disgrace, Mrs. Sterling. She's learned that her worth isn't determined by other people's financial decisions or social positions. She's building a life based on her own efforts and authentic relationships. You could prevent all of this. You could restore even a portion of the trust fund, enough to stabilize the situation. Emma would benefit too, eventually. The desperation in Margaret's voice was almost heartbreaking, but it didn't change the fundamental reality. The Sterling family had built their lives on unsustainable assumptions about other people's money, and now they were facing the consequences of those choices. Mrs. Sterling, the money has been donated to a scholarship foundation. 20 young women are attending college debt-free because of those funds. They're building careers and supporting families who understand the value of sacrifice and hard work. I'm not going to take educational opportunities away from deserving recipients to bail out a family that never appreciated what they were asking for. Then what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to tell my husband that we're losing our home because our son's ex-wife's mother won't restore money that was supposed to be his inheritance? You're supposed to tell your husband the truth. That your family built financial plans around money that was never promised to you, borrowed against assets that belonged to someone else, and made assumptions about Emma's value that had nothing to do with who she actually was as a person. After Margaret hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, thinking about the conversation and its implications. The Sterling family's financial collapse was a direct result of their entitled assumptions about Emma's inheritance. But it was also poetic justice for the way they'd treated both Emma and me. I called Emma that afternoon to tell her about Margaret's call. She listened without interruption as I explained the situation, her silence growing heavier with each detail. "So Jonathan borrowed money expecting to invest it alongside my trust fund?" she asked when I finished. "Apparently so. And when the trust fund wasn't available, those investments became unsustainable." Emma was quiet for a long moment. "Mom, I need to tell you something. Something I should have mentioned earlier but was too ashamed to admit." "What is it?" "Jonathan asked me about the trust fund before we got engaged. He'd heard Margaret talking to someone about family financial planning, about the importance of both partners bringing assets to a marriage. When he proposed, he specifically mentioned how wonderful it was that we'd both be contributing to our shared future. The revelation wasn't entirely surprising, but it confirmed what I'd suspected about Jonathan's motivations for the marriage." "He knew about the trust fund before the wedding?" "He knew there was supposed to be one. Margaret had done some research into your business, found out about your success, and made assumptions about what that meant for my inheritance. They'd been planning their financial strategy around that money for months." "And you didn't think to mention this when we were discussing the trust fund?" Emma's voice was small when she answered. "I was still hoping that somehow I could have both. Your money and their approval. I thought if I could just manage the situation carefully enough, I could keep everyone happy." "Emma, that's exactly the kind of thinking that got you into this mess in the first place. You can't build authentic relationships by managing other people's expectations about money." "I know that now. But at the time, I was so desperate to belong somewhere that I convinced myself I could make it work." The next morning, I drove to Emma's apartment to continue our conversation in person. She was living in a small one-bedroom place not far from my own modest complex, furnished with second-hand pieces and decorated with personal touches that reflected her authentic tastes, rather than designer expectations. "How do you feel about Jonathan's financial problems?" I asked as we sat together at her kitchen table. Emma considered the question carefully. "Sad for him, I suppose. But not responsible. He made those decisions based on money that was never his, money he never earned or deserved. The fact that his family built their plans around my inheritance says more about their values than anything else. And Margaret's call to me? Desperation. She's realizing that their social position was built on assumptions about money and status that weren't as solid as they thought. When those assumptions fell apart, they had nothing authentic to fall back on. I was proud of Emma's response. The woman who'd once been willing to sacrifice our relationship for social acceptance now understood the difference between authentic stability and the illusion of security based on other people's assets. "There's something else I want to discuss with you," I said. "The Scholarship Foundation is expanding, and I'm looking for someone to help with administration and recipient support. Someone who understands what it's like to make mistakes and learn from them." Emma's eyes widened. "Are you offering me a job?" "I'm offering you an opportunity to help young women avoid the kind of mistakes you made. To use your experience with social pressure and financial manipulation to guide others who might be facing similar challenges." "But I'm not qualified for that kind of work. I don't have experience with nonprofits or educational administration." "You have experience with choosing money over relationships and learning why that choice was wrong. You have experience with families that measure worth by bank account balances and learning to value different things. You have experience with rebuilding your life based on authentic values after losing everything that seemed important." Emma was quiet for a moment, considering the implications. "You want me to work for the foundation that received my inheritance?" "I want you to help ensure that inheritance serves young women who will appreciate its value and use it to build meaningful lives. I want you to help them understand that their worth isn't determined by their families, financial status, or their ability to meet other people's monetary expectations." The position would pay a modest salary, nothing compared to what Emma might have earned in her previous corporate role, or what she would have inherited from the trust fund. But it would allow her to use her experiences to help others while rebuilding her relationship with work that reflected her actual values. "I'd like that," Emma said finally. "I'd like to help other young women avoid the mistakes I made." Over the following months, Emma threw herself into the foundation work, with the same intensity she'd once applied to winning the Sterling family's approval. But this time, her efforts were directed toward something meaningful, something that honored the sacrifice the money represented rather than squandering it on social positioning. She developed mentorship programs pairing scholarship recipients with women who'd built successful careers through their own efforts. She created workshops on financial literacy and authentic relationship building. She spoke at high schools about the pressure to transform yourself for other people's approval and the importance of staying true to your values. The work was deeply personal for Emma, a way of processing her own experiences while helping others avoid similar pitfalls. She often told scholarship recipients about her wedding, about the choice she'd made to prioritize social acceptance over family loyalty, about the consequences of that decision and the lessons she'd learned. The hardest thing about losing that inheritance, she would tell them, wasn't losing the money. It was realizing that I'd become someone who didn't deserve it, someone who'd forgotten what my mother's sacrifice actually meant. 6 months after starting with the foundation, Emma received a letter from Jonathan. He was writing from a rehabilitation facility where he was being treated for gambling addiction and substance abuse problems that had apparently contributed to his financial downfall. The letter was an apology, an acknowledgement of the pressure he'd put on her to be something she wasn't, an admission that his family's expectations had been unreasonable and destructive. He says he's learning about authentic relationships and personal responsibility. Emma told me as we reviewed foundation applications together. He says he understands now why I left him. How does that make you feel? Grateful that I got out when I did. If I'd stayed, if you'd restored the trust fund to keep me in that marriage, I would have enabled his problems instead of forcing him to face them. The insight showed how much Emma had grown since her wedding day. She now understood that sometimes the most loving thing you could do for someone was to refuse to enable their destructive choices, even when that refusal caused immediate pain. The Sterling family's social decline was swift and dramatic. Their country club membership was revoked when they couldn't pay dues. Their prestigious home was sold to cover debts. Margaret Sterling was seen working as a retail clerk at an upscale department store, a job that would have horrified her during her days of looking down on people who worked for wages. Emma felt sympathy for their situation but no responsibility for it. They built their lives on other people's money and other people's approval. She observed, when those external supports disappeared, they had nothing authentic to sustain them. Meanwhile, the scholarship recipients were thriving. Maria Gonzalez had graduated from nursing school and was working in a community health clinic, serving families like the one she'd grown up in. Ashley Chen was in her 3rd year of medical school, maintaining a perfect GPA while volunteering at free clinics on weekends. Each success story validated my decision to redirect the trust fund toward young women who understood its true value. Emma often attended scholarship awards ceremonies, speaking to recipients about the importance of staying true to their values even when faced with pressure to transform themselves for other people's approval. Her message was always the same. Authentic relationships and meaningful work were worth more than social position or inherited wealth. My mother spent 25 years building this foundation money, she would tell them, not because she wanted to impress anyone or buy her way into exclusive social circles, but because she wanted to give young women like you opportunities to build meaningful lives. Honor that sacrifice by staying true to who you are, no matter what pressures you face. The foundation continued to grow, funded not just by my original donation, but by contributions from people who'd heard Emma's story and wanted to support young women facing similar pressures. We established chapters in 3 states, each one focused on helping first-generation college students whose mothers were working to support their education. Emma's transformation was complete, but it hadn't happened overnight. It had required losing everything she thought she wanted, facing the consequences of her choices, and slowly rebuilding her life based on authentic values. The process had been painful but necessary, the kind of growth that could only happen when someone was forced to examine their deepest beliefs about worth and relationship. I used to think the worst thing that could happen was losing social status. Emma told me one evening as we worked late at the foundation office. Now I realize the worst thing was almost losing myself, trying to maintain status that was never really mine. The trust fund was gone, but Emma had gained something more valuable, the knowledge that her worth wasn't determined by other people's money or approval. She'd learned to build relationships based on mutual respect and shared values rather than financial convenience. She'd discovered work that reflected her authentic priorities rather than social expectations. The scholarship recipients would graduate debt-free and build careers based on their own efforts and their mother's sacrifices. Emma had built a new life based on meaningful work and genuine relationships. The Sterling family had learned that financial stability couldn't be built on other people's assets or entitled assumptions. And I had learned that sometimes the most loving thing you could do for someone was to let them face the consequences of their choices until they learned to make better ones. The trust fund had served its purpose after all, just not in the way I'd originally intended. It had taught Emma the difference between earned and unearned wealth, between authentic and transactional relationships, between character and social positioning. The money was gone, but the lessons would last forever, and that, ultimately, was the inheritance that mattered most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.